All right. I believe I am live on YouTube. This one's not going to be too long, but it's been a minute since I've done YouTube videos, and I figured it would be a good chance to offer something new, give you all a quick life update, just in terms of what I've been up to the past couple of years. Published a book, Seeing Through the World. I can share that in the video notes. I've been working with Revelor Press as a publisher. I now have the imprint through that called Integral Imprint, so a lot of interesting philosophical books will be coming out in the next few years. And I've already come out with helped to publish two, authored one called Seeing Through the World, as I mentioned, and then the other one is by Becca Tarnas, and that one is called Journey to the Imaginal Realm. And that's sort of a read-through analysis and reflection of The Lord of the Rings and J.R.R. Tolkien. Been running a podcast. You should definitely check that out if you haven't. It's called Mutations. And in that podcast, I'm talking with a lot of scholars and authors and writers and just people on the internet that I find to be very interesting, compelling, considering the interim world that we find ourselves in, and considering the difficulties and challenges and pushes and pulls as we're trying to figure out how to enact a new culture, how we're going to navigate the cultural crisis that we're in the present. There's been a lot of interesting developments in terms of new language around this interim culture. I had been involved for a number of years with Reality Sandwich magazine, publishing and editing through them. And a number of years ago, we of course had the integral theory culture and integral movement through Ken Wilber. But then also with Reality Sandwich, we had this kind of consciousness culture, generically speaking, a counterculture. We had folks like, and still do, folks like Charles Eisenstein talking about the time between stories. We also have a kind of an articulation. I've reiterated that in a slightly different way as the time between times that we're in right now. And my work has been very much focused, and by extension my podcast and my writing has been very focused on how to kind of get a sense of the phenomenology of that in-betweenness. The phenomenology of being kind of at the tail end of one expression of culture and the incipient newness and freshness, but also fragileness of whatever's emerging, even if it's not necessarily not up to the challenge. It is. It's just that it's so young and fresh and unclarified that it's very difficult to get a clear sense of what it actually is. Now, Mcluhan talks about this, Marshall Mcluhan, quite a bit, just this idea or this notion that we can look specifically and very much especially at forms of art and expression in forms of art that can kind of tell us or reveal to us what to be looking for, what we're wrestling with in our sense ratios. We're calling it sense making, or the war on sense making today, which is something that's emerged in contemporary conversations. I think that's a good articulation and expression of what we're dealing with, which is really how do we organize our senses and learn to be in the world. And we're in a culture that has fundamentally lost the sense of how to orient itself in the world, because the way in which it was doing so has not only helped to catalyze the cultural crisis that we're in, but it only seems to exacerbate it the more we lean into it. Its payoff and its yield has a shorter and shorter lifespan, right? We don't. It's almost like oil fracking. We get a little bit out of it, but this is not clearly the way forward. We're going to run out of this thing, and this sense of running out, the sense of exhaustion, both spiritually and psychologically, existentially, as we're facing the kind of ecological crisis, is kind of what I wanted to get at for, I've called this becoming integral in the Anthropocene. What I'm getting at for this paper that I'm working on for the next few months for the Integral European Conference. And what I'm getting at here is so many of these communities, from the meta-modern to Game B to the integral movement, we're attempting to articulate what I'm understanding as a new ontology, right? Ontology in the philosophical tradition, as we understand it, is how are we being in the world? What is the nature of being? And it relates very naturally to phenomenological questions. What are we experiencing in our consciousness? What is it like to be a modern or a postmodern or a post-postmodern and now a meta-modern? What are the difficulties and challenges, and what are these sensorial modes that we enact? And are those changing? And can we learn how those are changing through our art and through our cultural expressions? Many of you know that my background is with Jean Gebser. Gebser was an integral theorist of sorts. He called himself a cultural philosopher. And he, along with a number of other thinkers, popularized the term integral theory, integral philosophy, etc. So that's sort of the constellation I find myself in. But what Gebser saw is, and I believe this has a synergy with our time, because he was writing this in 1949. What Gebser saw was that in the 1940s, we were in a kind of interim world. That the kinds of things that culture was producing and yielding were Janus-faced, right? There's the Janus in Greek myth is, it's looking up and it's looking down. It has two faces. So there's a sense that our culture is both looking ahead and in anticipation of the new, and then also kind of mired in the old, or reinventing the old for certain reasons and kind of bringing it back up, dredging it back up, and mingling it with the new, which makes it for a very kind of confusing experience. So what I'm looking at then, as we try to navigate these attempts to describe the present, the vertigo of the present, the challenges of the present, the in-betweenness of the present, is by doing that, can we further clarify what is emerging, what could be blossoming forth, emerging forth from the trials and tribulations and the storm of and the chaos that is the contemporary world. And I do think that if we look at the nature of the crisis itself, if we look at the nature of, let's say, the ecological crisis and the climate crisis, then we get more of a sense of what's actually trying to kind of, I don't know, I don't want to get too two-dimensional about it, but there's almost a lesson in there. And the lesson is the multidimensionality of the ecological crisis, the complexity of it, but then also what philosophers like Timothy Morton, he's an eco-philosopher, are calling hyper-objects, the hyper-objectivity of the crisis. That the way in which we relate to the world is being challenged by the climate crisis. The way in which we experience time is being challenged by it. But it's not only a challenge, there's also a new insight. There's also a new way to relate. And this is what I find to be very interesting in the humanities right now, from Tim Morton in eco-philosophy and what he calls hyperobjects, to object-oriented ontology, to the non-human turn, and then also to integral philosophy. And what I'm trying to do is to bring these things together in a kind of a constellation with one another, so that an integral philosophy is going, okay, let's listen to the phenomenology of culture in the present in order to understand what is emerging in culture. Allow it to inform us rather than necessarily prescribe a particular framework or developmental theory onto it. So that's sort of what I'm looking at in my talk in Hungary in a couple of months. And these are just kind of working through kind of notes to not only help myself, but maybe get a little bit of feedback from YouTube community, if any of you guys are still out there, is trying to find ways to articulate this through examples. what I've been playing with, an aspect of this, if you're not familiar, of course, I mentioned the Anthropocene. It's in the title of this video. Anthropocene is, ironically, a description by Paul Crutzen, a scientist, of the age that we're entering into, where human beings now have a geological impact on the Earth, that we have kind of expanded and intensified our activity on the planet to a geological scale. And this kind of is interesting and very strange questions about what it means to be human, and what the divides between nature and culture really are. And it makes us kind of challenge and question those assumptions. And it's this kind of melting down of borders and boundaries between the subject and object, between nature and culture, the human and the non-human, the more than human world, and then the very, very human world, that they're beginning to melt down. They're beginning to become transparent to one another. In a way, yes, enacted through a crisis, but nevertheless enacted. And so this is the challenge of the integral age. This is the challenge of the integral ontology. Gebser describes it as the supersession of dualism. And I think this has a lot of correspondence with Timothy Morton's work and a lot of ecological philosophers' work. And if we can lean a little bit now into clarifying some of these descriptors, we might actually be able to have a stronger sense of the world that is emerging beyond just being a civilizational collapse or crisis. It's also a new way to live and die with the rest of the planet. I think the works of Donna Haraway are also very important in her book, Staying with the Trouble, discussing two important concepts here that are very kind of integral oriented, and that would be the Cthulhu-cene, and this is a playful way of her kind of shrugging off the Anthropocene as a word that's too human-centric. I mean, anthropos means human, and it's right in the title, it's right in the name, and yet this should be the most open epoch, culturally speaking, to the non-human world, and yet we're describing it as the Anthropocene. So she's sort of challenging that. The Cthulhu-cene as well is a way to talk about sense-making. Very often through the book, she's describing the allowing oneself to let their feelers go out with other beings in their environment, in symbiotic relationship, across time and space, across different organisms. So there's this kind of entangled sensorium that she's always describing throughout the book. And she also brings up another interesting distinction that might help us understand what an integral ontology could begin to look like, other than the dropping down of distinctions and borders and boundaries between subject, object, nature, culture, etc. There's also this sense of what she's calling, as opposed to autopoiesis, the self-organizing principle that Francisco Varela and Humberto Mascherano have popularized in consciousness studies. If you're not familiar with that, it's sort of a difficult concept, but go ahead and feel free to Google it to get a little deeper into their definition. But Haraway is sort of twisting that a little bit and taking an issue with the phrase autopoiesis, because it feels like something kind of just emerges out of itself, right? It just sort of comes up and self-organizes. And really her new term is just a way to lean into a new accentuation. So she has sympoiesis. And sympoiesis then is this, yes, things self-organize, but they really self-organize with. They organize with things. And the withness of things is a kind of way of being in the world that we haven't been emphasizing well enough. So she's shifting us from the autopoiesis to the sympoiesis, describing our epoch as the Cthulhu-cene. And then this is the part that weaves us back to Mcluhan and integral philosophy, etc. And this is this idea that what we can be doing in the Cthulhu-cene, or this new integral world, is finding ways in which we can relate to the withness of other beings, and producing culture this part's a little tricky. Producing culture that, in a sense, is kind of like a weaving together of stories and narratives and sort of knitting together a new culture. She uses the cultural examples of basket weaving, right? And she uses many, many other examples from the rest of the natural world, the non-human world, to help kind of get what's going on with this. So there's this weaving together of myth and storytelling and folk-telling that enables and empowers us to kind of produce a new world to learn how to live and die well in. So I do think that the ecological emphasis in this is very important, and so that is why I'm calling my talk "Becoming Integral in the Anthropocene." Now, what I'm hoping to do is really kind of bring in the integral theory world to more of this phenomenological approach that I've been describing, that is present in Mcluhan's work. It was present in Gebser's work. It's present in writers like historians like William Irwin Thompson, and really kind of helping them to become more present in the integral world. Because as it stands at the moment, there's a big emphasis on humanistic. That's the wrong word. In the Aquil quadrant map, there's the upper left, and that's really kind of focusing on individual development, self-actualization, psychology as a field, particularly looking at transpersonal, modes of self-actualization beyond the existential, beyond just sort of becoming an adult, and developmental models of adult development. And that's really the emphasis. It's the emphasis on that. It's the emphasis on how we can apply that to organizations. It's the emphasis on how we can apply that to cultural evolution at large and different value sets that are happening in culture. But it's all through, I think, fundamentally this base lens of looking at it from the individual perspective. And like autopoiesis, I'm kind of suggesting that we just sort of shift to the sympoiesis side of things and look more at this sort of shared phenomenological ground that's going on, not just in the individual, but in cultures, in life worlds. So hopefully that was interesting as a spontaneous recorded session, kitchen talk of sorts. If you have more thoughts about this, please leave a like or comment, and be sure to subscribe if you're somehow stumbling upon this video. I definitely would be interested in hearing some of your thoughts and maybe some ideas for some future reflections to record and converse with together. All right, thanks guys, and I will leave a link to some of this stuff in the blog in the show notes, so thanks.